Man City's 3-0 win over Manchester United on Sunday was an interesting match for a number of reasons, but for me in particular, I think there were two major issues for Man United, perhaps even one major issue for Pep Guardiola's team too. It's really worth noting and talking about today. Let's start with Manchester United, and the biggest issue for me watching this game was Bruno Fernandes in the middle of the pitch. Now, it might be a little mean to pick on Fernandes in this game when he's undoubtedly one of Manchester United's better players, and a player that was fundamentally being tasked with playing a role that just isn't suited to him. He is a number 10, he's an attacking player. Ruben Amorim obviously felt a necessity to play him in that midfield duo alongside Ugarte, and it just didn't really work. Whether it was him not tracking Phil Foden for that first goal, or whether it was him kind of taking up the spaces and blocking the kind of passing routes to Benjamin Sesko up front, it really felt like Fernandes kind of stood out like a sore thumb in this Manchester United system. But in a sense, that's always kind of been the problem with Bruno Fernandes. He's this mercurial talent in the middle of the pitch. And at times it seems as though he's a jack of all trades, but not really a master of anything that successive Manchester United managers have struggled to build a team around. Now, obviously the Portuguese midfielder's fans would point to his remarkable goal tally for Man United and the fact that he creates a lot of assists each and every season as well for the club and say that's what he's good at, that's why he's a world-class player. But when you actually peel away those numbers and look at the context behind them, I think it actually shows a player that maybe doesn't perform as well as some of his biggest fans would suggest. For example, if you take away Fernandes' penalty goals from his entire career at Manchester United in the Premier League, his average over his entire time in English top flight is just 0.48 non-penalty goals and assists per 90 minutes. To put that into perspective, Kevin De Bruyne, while he was at Manchester City, averaged 0.78 non-penalty goals and assists per 90, almost double what Fernandes has managed at Manchester United. And I do appreciate that people listen to that and think, yes, well, De Bruyne was playing in a much better team, playing in a system that in many ways suited his style, and you're absolutely right. But then if you take a look at the Manchester United midfielders that came before him, in terms of Fernandes that is, I think it also underlines perhaps that he hasn't been perhaps as good as some would suggest. For example, in the season before Fernandes joined Manchester United, Paul Pogba averaged 0.45 non-penalty goals and assists per 90, so more or less identical to Fernandes' overall record. And in the season before that, Pogba, Henrik Mkhitaryan and Marouane Fellaini all averaged more non-penalty goals and assists from midfield than Fernandes has averaged since he joined Old Trafford Club. I guess what I'm trying to say here is I just don't really buy the excuses about Fernandes anymore. Yes, he's a good player and perhaps he would work very well in a very good team, but I guess there's just kind of no real obvious solution or role for him in this team in Ruben Amorim's system. And I keep coming back to this idea that the club perhaps would have been far better just selling him in the summer and using that money to properly rebuild this midfield, because whether it's Fernandes and Casemiro, Fernandes and Mason Mount, or as we saw, Fernandes and Ugarte, it never seems to work. The other big issue that stood out to me for Manchester United on Sunday was Ruben Amorim's tactics and their real necessity to make the most of the wing-backs on the pitch. Obviously in a 3-4-3 system you have to make use of your wing-backs because they're the best passing outlet from defence. They're also really important in a defensive aspect as well. And I found that quite odd that Amorim has chose a formation that makes the most of those positions when we consider the players that he has to offer at Manchester United in that squad, it maybe leaves a little to be desired. For example, while Patrick Dorgu is by no means a bad player and perhaps has plenty of potential to develop into a top-class Premier League player, he's still learning his trade. He's still coming to terms with the Premier League, and he wasn't exactly bombing up and down that left wing and causing Pep Guardiola's defence huge amount of issues. In fact, on a number of occasions he looked entirely isolated because he struggled to link up with Man United's attack. Similarly, Nazir Mazraoui is by no means a world beater. I do appreciate that he is much better in a Man United shirt than he was in a Bayern Munich top. But when we take a look at his passes and crosses over the course of the game here, we can see that while he was available to take a touch and maybe pass back and forth, he made very, very little intention of actually offering much in the final third. Now that maybe would have changed if Diogo Dalot was fit and able to play in this game, but again, he's not exactly a world-class wing-back. He's a very good player by all means, but maybe not a world-class player. But the point I'm trying to make here isn't just to pick on these players, the point is to pick on the system. You know, it's all well and good that Manchester United maybe don't have world-class players in every position, But football is a weak-linked sport, and by that I mean it's a sport in which teams win or lose based on the worst player in their team. And without really trying to pick on any individual, I found it really weird that Ruben Amorim's tactics have not only, as we mentioned, highlighted Bruno Fernandes' limitations, but it also puts this extra importance on the wing-backs when Manchester United perhaps don't have the best array of wing-backs to pick from. So again, a very odd decision from the Manchester United manager, as he's maybe trying to shoehorn players into his system rather than finding a system that gets the best out of his better players in that squad. And last but not least, I also want to touch on Manchester City before I wrap up here. I thought what was quite damning for Manchester United in this game was the fact that Manchester City beat them relatively comfortably with what I thought was a really underwhelming performance. Yes, Erling Haaland scored some great goals, and yes, Jeremy Doku looked outstanding with his dribbling and in possession, but on the whole I thought Pep Guardiola's team looked well off it and were struggling to kind of control this game as much as they perhaps would have done in the past. What actually really stood out to me in this match was the manner in which Manchester United kept getting back into it. I know they didn't score a goal, but they kept having opportunities to attack and attack and attack. And what I found really interesting was, according to Opta, Man United actually averaged more passes into the final third and completed more penalty area entries than Manchester City. And sure enough, they actually also finished the game with an expected goals of 1.2 to Manchester City's 1.9. Now that obviously didn't matter because Manchester United didn't end up scoring a goal, but it is a sign of a worrying trend that is growing in Pep Guardiola's team in the way that they have seemingly become far less and less reliable from a defensive point of view. As we can see in this graph, Man City have conceded on average 1.28 XG per game in the Premier League this season. That may only be a slight increase on last season's average of 1.26, but it's a massive 36% jump on the defensive form in the 23-24 season, and more or less points to the club conceding on average almost twice as many chances per game as they did 5 seasons ago. Not to mention that this season's XG against average is actually higher than Leeds United and Sunderland's right now, and more than twice Arsenal's. So by all means, Manchester City fans should enjoy winning the derby and getting one over their rivals. But I do feel as though Pep Guardiola's team do have a fundamental issue in defence. And I do worry that they might not actually be able to achieve anything of significance this season unless Pep Guardiola can find a way to plug the holes in that backline.